Pat is my dear friend, and this is the way she rewards me for our friendship. I get to talk about the Middle East, but I get to talk about the Middle East with an amazing group of panelists, and you're going to meet them. Come on up. I will introduce all of you in just a moment. I think we know the order is Ann Patterson. Okay, got it. I just have to say congratulations to the Women's Foreign Policy Group. I remember listening to Pat Ellis talk about her dream of this group when it was founded more than 20 years ago, and to think that here you are, 20 years later, what you've accomplished, you've all laid it out this morning. It is truly extraordinary. What you've done not only for the discussion around foreign policy, to help make sure that women have a voice in the making of foreign policy and discussions about national security, the fact that you are bringing along the next generation. I love seeing these young women here this morning. You are truly making a difference. You've made a difference, and you're going to go on to do that. You now have the strength and the presence in the foreign policy spectrum, and we know it was a spectrum that didn't always include the voices of women. So I just want to applaud once again the organization and all of your amazing leaders. Let's give them a hand, the people who've made this possible. We do have a most impressive lineup for this discussion on the Middle East. They are all, you recognize them, they're all accomplished figures in their own right. I'm going to ask you just to read their full biography because it's extensive in your program, and I'm just going to, as I introduce them, just give you their title so that we can launch right into the conversation and have as much time as we can, because this topic, honestly, we could spend all day on it, but we're just going to spend a little more than an hour. And at some point, I know, Pat, you said we're going to be collecting questions from each table. So if you have questions, be thinking about them, and we'll collect those in a few minutes. In the blue on the far right is Ann Patterson. She is, as you know, the Assistant Secretary of State at the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Please welcome Secretary Ann Patterson. Seated next to Ann is Michelle Flournoy, the CEO of the Center for a New American Security. She's also, as you all know, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Welcome, Michelle Flournoy. Seated next to Michelle is Her Excellency, Dr. Alia Hatou Boran. She is the Ambassador of Jordan to the United States. Welcome, Ambassador Boran. And finally, on the ambassador's right is Ann Richard, the Assistant Secretary of State at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Secretary Richard, welcome. So let's launch right into this and ask, I just want to get from each one of you, your take, the subject can go in so many different directions, and we'll try to do as much as we can in the hour, but from each of your perspectives, how do you see the greatest challenge right now for the United States? I'm going to start with you, Secretary Patterson.
Well, there are multiple challenges now, and I see it as taking a generation to solve many of the problems in the Middle East. But in my view, the biggest challenge we face in the Middle East is sectarian divisions. And I think we've underestimated the impact of this, and I think it's extremely pervasive, and it's going to be very difficult to roll back. There are other issues, slow economic growth, chronic lack of institutions, which has been painfully obvious in a place like Libya. But I would say the most urgent issue we face is sectarian divisions.
Michelle Flournoy.
You know, I would agree with Ambassador Patterson that, you know, we are facing a set of challenges that we're going to be dealing with over the course of a generation. So I think the biggest challenge is to transition from reacting to the eaches, to the, you know, each crisis as it emerges, to really step back and consider what are our interests long term, you know, how do our values play in this, and what's a broader long-term strategy for the United States in the region into which we can fit the individual responses. Because I think we've just been buffeted from one crisis to the next. And at this point, given the long-term nature of what we're dealing with, we really have to take a more strategic approach.
Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, Well, I very much agree that the challenges are multiple, and the challenges are getting more and more complex in our part of the world. As a Jordanian, as we are very much in the middle of everything that's happening around us, probably we see, of course, we look at ISIS, we look at the instabilities, we look at the lack of confidence, we look at the multiple challenges and risks that we face. But for Jordan, the central and core foreign policy issue for us has been and will be is the peace process, is the peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the lack of which is really causing lots of lack of confidence in terms of the overall strategic look of how does the Middle East react with the different issues at hand. We know very well that the US-led role that President Obama and Secretary Kerry did the last year was incredible, and it's deeply appreciated by us. And we know how much we were very close to achieving some sort of framework agreement between the two parties. When we look at the peace and the progress of peace and the prospects of peace, myself, I was a negotiator during the times when Jordan and Israel did sign a peace agreement at that time. And I know the challenges. I know that we had our own ups and downs. But there was this strategic will that both countries did want to reach to that point, and we did. And we are now working with the rest of the parties, with the United States, of course, being at the forefront of this very important endeavor, and we are pursuing that very much each and every day.
From my perspective as the Assistant Secretary dealing with refugees, we have far too many crises in the world that have displaced more people now than at any time since World War II. We have over 51 million people who are either refugees or internally displaced in their own countries. And one of the most difficult places to aid people is turning out to be the displaced who are fleeing from or displaced within Syria. So the Syria crisis stands for me as a major challenge in the Middle East as we try to get aid to people who need it. And it's about half of the issues to get out early today that we're contending with. It's not that the U.S. is, for once, it's not that we're strapped for cash. We're actually the leading donor, and we have bipartisan support from Congress for our funding. So it's that we need the rest of the world to also be contributing, because there are so many crises, we're stretching our dollars further and further. We also see that within Syria, there's no respect for humanitarian principles. Aid workers are attacked, aid workers can't get through the lines, hospitals are bombed. There's a very ruthless waging of war there. So people are hard to reach. They're trapped in areas where neighborhoods that are sort of sealed off, where people are slowly starving to death. Refugees in other countries are living in cities. You've all seen photos of some of the very large refugee, there's a very large refugee camp in Jordan, Al-Zatri, that's the size of a city, but most refugees are not in camps, actually. They're in cities, and they're trying to make a go of it. And so it's harder to deliver aid to families who are trying to make it on the normal economy. It's very human to want to do that, but it's also harder to find them, register them, and get them the help they need. And then finally, you will have probably heard this, we stand to lose a generation of Syrian children who are out of school, are early workers on the labor market when they should be in school, or young girls are now child brides. And so I'm very concerned about the long-term effects of having all these children who should be in school and learning and planning for their future instead traumatized or idle, or worse yet, exploited and abused.
I'm glad you brought up the refugee question, and we are going to come to that this morning. I did want to start, though, with the news that has broken overnight on Michelle Flournoy. The administration is now planning to send 400, give or take, more military advisors to Iraq, specifically to work with Iraqi troops as they try to retake Ramadi and try to make progress in Anbar province. How do you see this move? What do you think it's in response to? Do you see it as strategic, tactical? What does it bring to the conflict?
I think this move to send additional trainers, probably 400 additional trainers, is a step in the right direction. In my view, the basic strategy is right, and that is that we have to support and enable the Iraqis to get a handle on the situation, both politically, by re-including the Sunni population as part of the governing structure and flowing more resources to the provinces, and militarily by getting the Iraqi forces to be more effective, training up both Kurdish and Sunni militias to be able to be local forces on the ground that eventually get integrated into the Iraqi security forces and so forth. But I think the general hesitancy to get pulled back into Iraq in a major way has made the administration go slow and go and take incremental steps. And so the initial tranche of trainers was positive, but it wasn't enough to get both down to the right level of training within these units, nor was it adequate to really cover down on the areas where the Sunni population is dominant. So I think this is a first step. It's not by itself going to be enough, though. I mean, I think ultimately we're going to have to provide spotters who can call in airstrikes and make air cover effective for the fighting forces on the ground. We're going to have to put more pressure on the Iraqi government to make some political compromises to bring the Sunnis back in. And so this is, I think, a very positive step, but more needs to be done along these lines if the strategy is going to be effective.
But times of the essence, why not do the more aggressive steps now?
I think they should do the more aggressive steps now. I think, again, there's just been a concern about this becoming a problem that the United States owns, and I understand that. But nature abhors the vacuum. And into this vacuum has, first of all, ISIS has stepped. And now Iranian-backed Shia militias have stepped. And the worst thing you could see, one of the worst things you could see in Iraq, is the further empowering of Shia militias to go into Sunni areas and conduct the scorched earth population. That would be like pouring gasoline on the sectarian tensions that Ambassador Patterson noted up front.
So, Ambassador Patterson, I mean, stepping back just a little, how is this move by the U.S., how is it going to be seen in the region? How do you see it making a difference in terms of the President has said to fix the problems in Iraq, there has to be a political solution. Does this help with the political solution?
I think Michelle is right, and I think the President pretty much said this when he talked to the G7, that we have a strategy, but it needs to be implemented more rapidly and more comprehensively, and the other members of the coalition, which there are a large number, need to step up to the plate with their own trainers. So, and I also think she's right, is that one of the issues, and it's believing is something that unique to the administration, because I'm up on the Hill a lot, is that people are desperately afraid to do something to this again, and the enormous costs and loss of life. And I think it's going to be well received in the region, and certainly among our coalition partners. And we've worked very hard with the government of Iraq and the new Prime Minister to do a new National Guard law for local security, to reverse de-Ba'athification, to put in place steps that will bring the Sunnis and the Kurds more into the political system, the Kurdish loyalty to pay the Kurds for their law. So I think there's some positive steps, but again, I think it does need to be implemented more rapidly to train the Iraqi security forces to control their own territory.
You're not worried about the reaction from Iran, or the reaction, what about, I mean, I'm curious, and I'm going to turn to you, Ambassador Blunt, on this in just a moment, but as the U.S. gets more involved, if we do get 12% sending spotters, or however many more forces, how do the Saudis look on this? How do you see Iran react?
The Saudis look positively, of course, on our assistance to the Sunni population, and they're very apprehensive about any Iranian encroachment in their neighborhood. And we've urged the Saudis to reopen their embassy policy in Iraq with Iran is essentially limited. We know that Iran is active there, militarily active there, and we try to, as I said, engage in but certainly not cooperate. And there'll be resistance, of course, from the Shia population to step up our presence. But again, I think our increased presence there has broad support across the whole range of non-Iraq.
Ambassador Braun, how does your government see this? I don't think that there's been time to respond. It's been a few hours. But in general, how does your government look at what's going on right now?
Well, definitely, the United States does look in a strategic manner when it comes to the different crises in Iraq and in Syria. And we, being on the ground, do understand very well what does it mean to be able to get across to all the sectors of the Iraqi parts of the society. And many, when they look at what's happening in Iraq, would just look at it from a ethnic sectarian, which is extremely, extremely wrong and extremely not right. And as Ambassador Patterson at the very beginning, probably this is for us in Jordan, this is the second most challenging issue in our part of the world when it comes to the different crises. This is going to stay for a long period of time. ISIS is going to be defeated. There is no doubt about that. ISIS is going to be defeated in a matter of probably it's going to take some years, but we know that the region is going to reject that kind of murderers that are claiming to be fighting, in the name of Islam, and they have nothing to do with Islam. We know this. The United States, definitely, I can't speak on behalf of the United States, the presence of Anne, and as ambassador, we very much appreciate the role that the United States is doing in Iraq, and the help and support that it's providing in terms of equipping the Iraqi army, the central government, and the support that the United States is providing for the Abadi government has been amazing. And this is also in coordination with the countries in the region in terms of empowering the Sunnis, the Shia. I don't want to go into the different groups, the Kurds, Iraqis in general. I mean, this is the language that I think we should be emphasizing on. It's just the Iraqis, all of them, and not the different sectarian groups here and there, because this is dividing even more the policy and the thinking of the normal Iraqi on the street. This is.
I was just going to say, let me extend this into Syria, because the U.S. has been even less willing to get itself involved in a way in Syria. There have been a lot of different proposals out there, Michelle Flournoy, about how the U.S. might do this, aid to the moderate rebels. The administration decided against that a couple of years ago. There have been talk about a no-fly zone. There's another proposal I know that was put on the table just recently. How do you see the U.S. Attitude right now towards Syria, and how do you see what's going on in Iraq is impacting Syria?
Yeah. My impression from the outside is that the U.S. is taking a sequential approach that really focuses first on trying to blunt and roll back ISIS in Iraq, and then address Syria and beyond that. In Syria, it's an incredibly difficult problem. Anybody who says there's an easy, quick solution has got to have their head examined. But I do think we had more options earlier that are now foreclosed, and now we're in a situation where if we put enough pressure on the Assad regime that it would collapse. The primary beneficiary at this point in time would be ISIS. So we benefit the wrong groups. Similarly, if you put enough pressure on the more radical groups in Syria, the primary beneficiary right now is going to be the Assad regime. The weakest party are the parties we want to ultimately see have a really strong voice at the negotiating table at some point whenever this is, the final disposition of Syria will be discussed. And it won't be decided on the battlefield. It will be decided at a negotiating table. But what happens on the battlefield will determine who has what kind of power coming into that negotiation. And the weakest parties are the moderates right now. And so the question I have is, how do we create, help reconstitute a more moderate set of players in Syria? I don't think that training 5,000 people a year is going to do it. And so looking at questions of, can we create some sort of buffer zones, safe zones, that allow populations to be protected, that allow the opposition to reconstitute? It's an important thing to debate. It's highly costly, it's highly risky. These things are not surgical, they're not clean. It would be putting U.S. people in harm's way, coalition members in harm's way. We've got to have a broader strategy for how we enable the empowerment of more moderate forces, while we work very hard to contain this, to help Jordan, stay stable, to help Turkey stay stable. Try to reduce the impacts on Lebanon. I mean, in some ways, you're trying to impose a tourniquet so that this instability doesn't spread beyond the borders further.
Secretary Patterson, how does the administration see this right now? I know what the president's said about it, but as Michelle said, it's almost as if the pressure grows every day to do something. How does the administration look at it?
Yeah, but that's where it gets elusive, what the something will be. And that's a really difficult issue, because the administration, and I think very properly so, has made the decision to go after Iraq first, to go after ISIL first, and certainly has taken many steps against ISIL in Syria, because that's the most important strategic threat to our allies like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, not to mention the barbaric humanitarian issues that we see on our TV. So we've tried to prioritize, necessarily to prioritize, to stabilize the situation in Iraq, to eliminate ISIL from Iraq, and then essentially deal with Syria. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a massive humanitarian underway to help neighboring countries, the Train and Equip program to help Syrian moderates, which I think, again, Michelle is right, has been slow, but we're trying to accelerate that as much as possible, to flow money into civil society groups in the north to keep them alive until peace can come. And the Secretary has been vigorously engaged in a diplomatic effort with the Russians and the Saudis and others to try and promote a settlement in Syria. But on ISIL, we have a 62-member coalition. Many of the allies, like Jordan, have been extremely active in pushing back on ISIL, and Spaniards, many of them represented in this room. So that's basically the approach, is to prioritize ISIL in Iraq.
And do you think that's working?
Well, I think, yes. I think Ramadi was certainly a setback, but the President said very clearly when this started that it was going to be a 3-year strategy, and we're about 9 months into the 3-year approach. It's going to take a long time, yes, but I think there's made progress against ISIL in Iraq.
Secretary Richard, from the standpoint of somebody who watching the refugee issue, and you laid that out very well for us a few minutes ago, what's at stake in terms of how long the Syrian crisis is allowed to continue?
Well, as we were talking about, we stand to lose a generation of Syrian children. And the head of the UN Development Program, Helen Clark, said that Syria has lost 30 years of development. And what we see is that the longer this goes on, the harder recovering from it will be. So it's not just the damage that's done today, it's also the damage that will linger. In the refugee world, our greatest hope is that people will be able to go home again. And so with every day that goes by violence inside Syria, it's going to be harder for Syrians to return, because their schools are gone, their hospitals are gone, their places of business and employment are gone, their homes are gone. So it's going to be a very different country that they would look to return to if and when peace comes to pass.
I want to ask you all to step back for a minute and look at this. I mean, it's so hard not to just look at the granular aspects of this, because there's so many terrible things going on in Syria, and of course of course, in Iraq with what ISIS is doing. But in the longer term, I mean, we're in the middle of getting ready to have another presidential election. The candidates are weighing in on this. I'll come back to you, Michelle Flournoy, to start this. How should the United States think about what its responsibility is in this part of the world? Is this a place that the U.S. just is forever going to be mired down in, whether it's in a hot war or a medium boil conflict? How do you see it? What's at stake for the United States here, and what's the responsibility of the U.S.? And I know we talk about and I'm asking you to weave into this. You know, we keep hearing, well, if the people in the region aren't sending troops in and they don't think it's important enough to do that, then why should the U.S.? So, you know, how do you see that, and how should the U.S. see that?
You know, I do think that whether we like it or not, we have long-term interests in the stability and development of the Middle East as a region. Many Americans, now that we're experiencing our own energy revolution, say, oh, well, we can walk away from the Middle East. Why do we care? But we do care, A, because, you know, oil is globally priced. It's priced on world markets, so fluctuations, disruptions in supply, wherever they occur, affect us, even if we become a net energy exporter. But we also care about the region, you know, the capacity for safe havens to be created, to once again export terrorists to our shores. One of the things that worries me most is the sort of latent threat of ISIS, meaning thousands of European passport holders who do not require visas to come to the United States are going to join ISIS. They're getting battlefield training. They're going to go back to their home countries. A couple of hundred of Americans, same thing. I mean, this is a latent threat we have to worry about. We also have key partners and allies who we have a great interest in their security, whether it's Jordan and other Arab partners or countries like Israel and our long-term commitment there. So we can't walk away from this region. And historically, and I think in the future, the U.S. does have a critical role to play in pulling together the international community, in formulating a coherent strategy, in motivating others to chip in and do their part. We cannot do it alone. These events that are happening are of monumental proportions. No country has the pen in writing the future history of the Middle East. But we can't be absent, because when the U.S. is absent, the whole region, it usually fails to cohere around a common, coherent strategy. So we have a critical role to play.
And yet, Ambassador Baran, when the U.S. is involved, it also stirs up antagonisms, and many would argue it makes the situation worse in terms of stirring up younger people in many of these countries who don't have a direction yet in life, and they're looking at what the U.S. is doing, and they're asking, why is the great Satan here in our midst?
Not at all. In Jordan, well, we very much look up for the leadership of the United States. And we have been strategic partners when it comes to fighting and counterterrorism all over the world. We believe that when it comes to ISIS, that the message that's coming from Jordan and its Masjid is as follows. This is a war within Islam. The Arab and the Muslim world have to take the leadership role in it. It is under the umbrella of the United States, under the leadership of the United States in terms of the expertise, in terms of this strategy, in terms of the knowledge, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, when you look at the totality of what's happening in our part of the world, when you look at what each and every family is talking about, you will hear us say, those people do not represent us. Those have nothing to do with Islam. They are just hijacked this noble religion for their own political purposes, and they're doing those horrors in the name of Islam. What we're saying on the larger picture, this voice have to be much louder. I mean, we are saying this amongst ourselves, but we're not vocal enough when it comes to the fact that this is a fight and this is a war within Islam. His Majesty is saying we're very much convinced that this is the case. First of all, we want the United States and the West out of harm's way. We don't want, at a later stage, someone to come that this is a fight between the East and the West, or Christian, Muslim, what have you. It's not the case at all. It has to do with the flaws and with the ill mentalities of some of the people that claim to be the leaders of ISIS and what have you. Unfortunately, some of the political processes in our part of the world did help in the development and the evolution of ISIS, but we're determined. We will not allow a group of killers and murderers to behave like what they're behaving right now, and we are very, very determined. Jordan is very proud to be part of the coalition. We fly and we are active in Iraq within the terms of reference of the coalition, and we are extremely proud to do that. But also, there are other venues where we are all, as international community, can combat ISIS in terms of the media, in terms of the totality of the social services.
The internet.
And the internet. Yeah. We know that ISIS generates 90,000 social media messages a day. Right. A day. The foreign fighters, I mean, this is, they're building a false image that it's not there. When you look at the videos and everything, it's all staged. It's all done in a way that they are superhumans, you know, the way they enter Ramadi or the way they have entered Mosul. It's absolutely not the case. We're there, we're on the ground, we know all the things that they are able to do in terms of media issues to give that kind of strength message to the rest of the world, which is extremely false.
It's been a very powerful message. There was a fascinating story this morning, I think it was in the Washington Post, about how very courageous young Syrians are trying to get messages out from inside Raqqa, where ISIS is in control, to let the world know that it's not all wonderful the way ISIS wants us to believe. Ambassador Richard, did you want to say something? Did I hear you?
Well, just on the ISIS threat and how it's impacting innocent civilians in Iraq. You know, it has created a new displacement crisis inside Iraq as civilians have fled from the fighting, have fled from ISIS. And so this is the second time that we've seen massive displacement of Iraqis. And so some of the issues that we raised earlier with the Syria crisis, we also see then in Iraq in terms of needing to get aid in a time when donors feel strapped. There's too many crises going on. And perhaps the Iraqis, because they have some resources, are sort of expected to do much of this themselves. And it's very hard for the Iraqi government to be fighting a war and helping its own displaced people at the same time. And so we were very grateful to Saudi Arabia last year that they donated $500 million as Iraqis fled to provide humanitarian assistance to innocent civilians who had fled. Another piece that's, for me, very encouraging is many Iraqis who are displaced flee to Kurdish areas. And what I found is that the Kurdish regional government has a very good, common sense, humane approach to helping people who flee into their country. I had visited the Kurdish regions, Erbil, when the Syrians first showed up. Now they also are hosting a lot of their fellow Iraqis, and they tend to do the right thing, in part because when I talk to the officials, they point out that they themselves have been displaced in the past. And so there's a very, if you're looking for silver linings, there's a very nice story there of people who were displaced turning around and being very good hosts to people who are now displaced. But you see a lot of the same issues that we worry about elsewhere in the Iraqi area. How to get donors to do more, how to get the Gulf states to care more, how to get aid to people who have fled a force that has no regard for human rights and for basic human dignity, and how people will be able to go home again after terrible things have happened to them in the neighborhoods from which they fled.
And these are the things we often don't think about when we're in the middle of a hot situation, as it is now. Secretary Patterson, let me come back to you with that larger question we were raising about the long-term U.S. role and responsibility in this part of the world. How does the administration, how do you see the role of the U.S. in contrast to and in partnership with the countries in the region. We've just seen a change of leadership in Saudi Arabia. I don't know to what extent do you think that changes the equation. How much of a lead should the U.S. be taking when other countries in the region are not able to, or in some cases not willing to, step up militarily?
Well, Michelle, as usual, did a great job of describing our strategic interests. Let me step back a second, though. Two things we haven't concentrated on that we'll need to concentrate on, or the next administration will need to concentrate on. And one is the lack of institutions. I mean, I know that sounds a bit like a cliche, but look at a country like Libya. I think we were seduced by the fact, we didn't understand the situation very well, but we were seduced by the fact that Libya had 7 million people and a lot of money, and we thought, well, that would be okay. But it wasn't okay, because it soon degenerated into 1,000 squabbling tribes. The other end of the spectrum, of course, was Yemen, where the same situation happened without the money. So we don't understand that function very well, the need to build institutions, again. And the other part is the economics of it, because these countries are staggeringly similar in the youth bulges and the high expectations and the unemployment rate of young people, particularly young men. So it's inherently destabilizing. And we don't really have an economic strategy for that region to promote investment. We're the world's largest market, to bring them into our orbit economically. And that's the long term. Those are the two long-term issues I think we need to focus on. And vis-a-vis the Gulf, we just had, I think, a very successful summit with the GCC members. It's certainly no secret to say they're extraordinarily apprehensive about the nuclear deal with Iran, and what they see, more importantly, it's the money that's going to be kicked loose by the sanctions relief. The new change in Saudi Arabia, we've had lots of interaction with King Salman, certainly over 40 years, not just recently, and the new leadership, and they're certainly more aggressive vis-a-vis Yemen and vis-a-vis the region. But Saudi Arabia is one of our oldest and most important allies in the region, and we'll continue to work with them very closely.
But you talked about institutions, a lack of institutions. How does the U.S. have influence in a situation like that without, again, stirring up the animosities that go on to make, other parts of the picture tougher, harder?
I think this business about the animosities is overrated. I mean, I know you see a lot of rhetoric out there, but over the years I've dealt with this, I think people are pretty eager to have the investment from the great Satan, the resources, so I think we'll get past that, but it's hard to build institutions. I mean, again, look at Libya, look at Yemen. We concentrate sometimes excessively, but importantly on the military and security institutions. But political parties, labor unions, all those things that make for some sort of transition, a civil service. I mean, as difficult as Egypt is, it does have a civil service. So we need to start working with these institutions more intensely and vigorously than we have.
Ambassador Baran, you mentioned at the outset the critical role of finding a peaceful solution between Israel and the Palestinians, but in many ways that is receded into the background as the focus has shifted so much to ISIS. How much does it matter, Michelle Flournoy, Secretary Patterson, that the U.S. put emphasis on finding the old-fashioned idea of a Middle East peace solution between Israel and the Palestinians? It just seems to have moved off the radar screen. I know it has not. The administration is still working on it, but how much does it matter?
I think it remains very important to continue to pursue as a goal, a two-state solution, a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It is, I think the plight of the Palestinians is often used as an excuse by more radical elements in the region, and who really don't care very much about the Palestinians, truth be told. But even if your primary concern is the long-term security of the state of Israel, if you look at the demographics inside Israel and the growth of the Arab populations within the territory that will be Israel in any conceivable solution, There will be a point in time where Israel will be forced to make a choice about whether it is a Jewish state or a democratic state. And I think you don't want to come to that point. You want to conclude a viable peace agreement that allows for a democratic Jewish state and allows for a viable Palestinian state. And I think a lot of the work that's been led by Secretary Kerry and General Allen and others have shown that there is a solution out there that's possible. It can be secured. There are security measures that can guarantee security on both sides. This is a question of political will, and I don't think we've seen the leadership on either side to be able to get to that. But that said, I think it's critical that we keep trying, that we keep moving the ball forward. My own view is that it's likely going to take some different leadership on both sides of the equation to actually get there.
What would you add?
I think. No, I can't say that. But what I can say is that this has been like a chronic disease. So I go to the Hill and I talk to these young staffers, some of whom may be here, and they don't even remember Camp David. So this is like living with a chronic disease in the Middle East for decades. Yes, it's hugely important to solve it. I mean, just think what solving it would do for a place like Egypt. And you come up with these Palestinian communities in a place like Syria and Yarmouk. So yes, it would be hugely important, and the Secretary, in some respects, a lot of progress was made that sort of isn't in the public domain. General John Allen and his team did a lot of work on designing security assurances for Israel. There was a lot of work done on the Palestinian economy, so that could be jump-started when peace came. But yes, it would have huge implications for the region. Plus, it would be a very important demonstration effect that you can solve these long-standing problems and that they're not intractable, and that might lead to solutions and momentum on some of our other issues in the region.
Do you see, Ambassador Baran, to come back to what you said, do you see real prospects for?
Well, we have to be hopeful all the time. And by the way, the feeling that this issue has been slipping down the political agendas worldwide is felt by Palestinians, is also felt by Israelis, is felt all over the world. Because basically Palestinians and Israelis do want peace. The two-state solution is the only viable solution on the ground. We're looking at the leadership, we're looking at the political framework, if I may, when the United States, Jordan, and the rest of the like-minded countries were pushing so hard for the final status negotiations. But if you are in Jerusalem, if you are in Tel Aviv, if you are in Ramallah, if you are in Jericho or any part, people feel that. People say, you know what, we're not at the priority list as it should be, because this is the longest conflict in history. The Palestinian people deserve their aspiration for a statehood. Right. The Israelis deserve to live in peace and harmony. The two-state solution, as Michelle said, is the only way that will keep the Israelis safe. It's the only way that will keep the totality of issues when it comes to the future of the Middle East in its right format. What we're saying in Jordan, that Israel should be part of the Middle East, not in the Middle East. The Israeli people have to be part of the overall population of the Middle East. This is how the integration should be. This is how the economy should be. Mothers in Ramallah and Jordan and Amman and Tel Aviv and the rest of the Arab capitals have to have a language among themselves, the communities, the industries, and so on and so forth. This is how we see it. This is how, because we've been through the process ourselves, probably I feel so passionate about it because I was there during as a person as well. I know it's difficult. I know sometimes you would think that, you know, this is extremely, extremely unachievable, but one has to have that inside sort of strength and the strategic look that this is something that has to be done. It's for the benefit of the next generation, and this is the most important thing on the table, at least for Jordan. It's our national, part of our national security and the national interest, sorry.
We hear the passion coming through. Ambassador Richard, you were I'm sorry, Secretary.
I didn't have a background in Middle East issues but obviously have been spending a lot of time visiting the region to deal with these refugee and displaced persons and humanitarian crises. And what comes through for somebody who's new to the region is how close together the major cities are of Damascus, Beirut, Jerusalem, and Amman. They're all driving distance from each other. For somebody who's used to going home up and down the East Coast, this is all what would be in the U.S. the neighborhood. You know, it really truly is a neighborhood. And so to have so many tensions, high feeling, displacement, pressures in a small area where people are used to moving, trading, working, living alongside, and then to have this much conflict, it's very much a high pressure cooker environment. I think you look at the map from this, from this distance in Washington, you see big areas of Iraq and Syria that are unpopulated or underpopulated. But when you visit, you realize how much people are living alongside each other. And so that's why efforts for peace are so desperately needed.
We've gotten a number of questions about ISIS and as well as the Middle East, which we just discussed. But I do want to raise a couple of these questions about Iran, which we've touched on. And I'll turn to Secretary Patterson and Michelle Flournoy first. The question is, should the U.S., the administration, continue negotiating with Iran on the nuclear deal and not engage Iran on their continued support of terrorist organizations, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so forth? I mean, how does the U.S. justify this?
I think we should be pursuing a two-track policy with regard to Iran. We have two issues. We have a number of issues, more than two issues. We have a number of issues with the Iranian regime. You know, the first is its pursuit of nuclear weapons. The second is its support for terrorist organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, now the Houthi insurgency in Yemen, others. Are very destabilizing. And the third is the way it treats its own people, the political oppression, violation of human rights inside Iran. So this is not, even though we are negotiating with regard to the nuclear question, in my view, this is more like, negotiated with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. It doesn't mean that suddenly you expect Iran to completely change its stripes. It's that you're trying to prevent a very troublesome power that's been done very destabilizing things in the region from becoming more empowered by having nuclear weapons. I think that is the right course of action to try to see if we can get a good enough deal. But it doesn't mean that we're not concerned with all of these other issues. And we need to be putting, every time Iran provides support for a terrorist or insurgent group that is threatening an ally or a partner, they need to be hitting up against U.S. and coalition resistance. And so we need to be pursuing these things in parallel. And I think while we've emphasized the nuclear file, we probably haven't done enough to reassure our partners and emphasize the fact that we continue to stand firm and perhaps even should redouble our efforts to counter Iranian destabilizing activities throughout the region. I think the GCC summit or the Gulf summit that the President hosted out in Camp David was a good step in that direction. But I think a lot more is necessary to reassure our partners that we are dealing not only with the nuclear threat, but the broader Iranian threat in the region.
Ambassador Patterson, what more should the U.S. be doing right now?
I think that is right. I mean, I think we're taking steps now to reassure our Gulf partners. The Iranians with the nuclear weapon is a huge threat to the region, the neighbors, and to Israel, and it would have provoked a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. So that is, frankly, an overwhelming national security of the interest of the United States, and we'll see whether we make a deal in the next few weeks. But I would suspect the signs are we'll see. But we're supposed to be.
Go ahead and say it.
We're supposed to be judicious about saying it. But yes, I think we'll make a deal with Iran, and I think that's extremely important in eliminating this. And the issue of nuclear proliferation in the region, I think, has been underestimated in the public debate on this. But yes, Iranian adventurism is a huge issue in the region. I mean, look at Yemen. Where the Iranians have essentially taken advantage of what was a long-standing civil war to support the Houthis in their effort. And we do need to do more to reassure the Gulf. And we had the GCC summit, and we're having, as we speak, a working group in Saudi Arabia with GCC countries to see what more we can do for them to bolster their security, to improve training of their security forces, to encourage them to cooperate more fully among themselves to meet some of these threats. We've tried to take steps. We have taken steps against Hezbollah. We've certainly met with the Houthis. We've talked to the Houthis about their role in this. So it is going to be a problem that requires constant attention from us.
Ambassador Boran, how do you want to weigh in on this? Because
well, it's very much a sovereign issue by the United States, but
yes.
We have, Jordan, very much, of course, supported and welcomed the negotiations between the P5 and P5+1 and Iran. And we very much look at it as an important step in eliminating the nuclear threat in the region. And we are very much supportive of the talks and of the negotiations. The role of Iran in general is the region. Of course, it's very much worrying and concerning for Jordan. The support for the non-state actors that are destabilizing the region is there and vivid, and it's sending so many messages. So I hope the international community will be able to do more in sending the right messages to Iran on matters that has to do with the support for the different actors that are doing so much harm to the region.
We've come back, we've gotten a number of questions about ISIS and about Libya, and without going back to ISIS completely again, I think there's still a question, Ambassador Patterson, or for any of you, how do we think about ISIS in the long term? I mean, you've brought up Libya. I mean, there's now real worry about what's happened in Libya. How does the U.S., in concert with its allies in the region, contain this threat? And let's talk about the foreign fighter issue, which has come up several times here. There is this appeal on the part of ISIS. How can the West, how can the U.S. and its allies do a better job of countering that attractive image that ISIS has been able to cultivate to some young people in the West?
I don't think we have a very good understanding of the draw of ISIS. I mean, why does India have 180 million mostly poor Muslims and no jihadis? Why does Tunisia, a relatively secular, progressive country, have more jihadis per capita than any other country on the planet? I don't think we get that, and I don't think we've done the sort of analysis that leads us to combat that. But we have tried to get started on this, and there is a lot of activity in the coalition about counter messaging, about trying to combat the 90,000 emails per day that go out. A lot of work that's been done in trying to stop the foreign fighter flow at its source, particularly from Europe, because there the return is going to pose a huge threat to us and our allies. So there's a lot of activity. The Turks have done not as much as they should, perhaps, but have taken steps to reduce the flow over their border and sent back thousands of people who've tried to get in through Turkey. So there has been, I think, some progress on the foreign fighter. But still, recruitment in ISIL remains pretty strong. We're just going to have to keep working on this in a combination of security and legal issues in the source countries and messaging to reduce the flow.
I would pick up on something that the ambassador said, which is about this fundamentally being a war within Islam. Competing narratives about what is truly representative of a great religion, one of the world's great religions, Islam. And, I think the most effective counters to the narrative, the false narrative of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others, and the radicalization process they use is going to come from within the Muslim world by putting forward the alternatives in a much and really in a more impassioned and forceful and compelling way. I think the United States can help by helping to invest in programs that build the resilience of communities to kind of create immunity to that being tempted to kind of adopt that kind of perspective. I think we can help in terms of funding more secular, modern education, so that for poor young children in certain parts of the world, the only possible education is not to go into some madrasa that's going to radicalize them in the process of educating them. But I also think there are unique U.S. rules. I mean, a lot of the technology, the servers, the technology that's being used for this messaging is hosted on U.S.-owned infrastructure. And this is a conversation I've been having with a number of my friends in Silicon Valley. Just like we now have clear laws and no tolerance for child pornography on the internet, and companies actively take down sites as they find them. We have to develop a set of both moral and legal approaches that allow us to identify what is support for terrorism and take it down, block them, actively block them. Now, I understand the free speech concerns, and we have to be very, very careful. But when something crosses the line to incitement to violence, incitement to killing people, incitement to murder, we have a responsibility to say, no, we're not going to enable and support that. And I think it's very challenging, but it's the processes that are being used inside the private sector now are extremely immature compared to like the processes we use for dealing with pornography or other illegal activities. So I think that's an area where we can make more of a difference than we're making right now.
And what is Silicon Valley's response in these conversations?
I think they're very, very, I think it's mixed. You can't, they're not, it's not a monolith. I think the companies that, agree with that impulse are very, very worried about the legality of what they're doing. They're very worried about protecting free speech, of not becoming censors, but they're also concerned about liability, both legal but also moral liability here. So I think it's an internal debate that they're having, and one that is important to move, to see progress, to get to a better solution, because we are too passive right now in using the instruments that we have at our disposal to deal with some of this.
You mean in the United States?
Yes.
You mean the West broadly?
I think the U.S. and the West. I mean, most of the infrastructure that's being used has been created and is operated by the West.
Okay, there's a number of great questions that have come in. I'm going to try to lump several of them together, Secretary Richard, about the refugee crisis and about what Americans can be doing, what the women and maybe some men in this room
there are 3 men, I think.
3 men,
yeah.
Okay. You're welcome, all of you. What we should know, what can anyone be doing at this point? People look at this plight, we see the stories coming across our television sets, the internet, our video screens, and it's just heart-wrenching. But what can realistically be done? Is it a matter of fundraising? Is it a matter of getting the money to the right place? Is it a matter of getting more governments to agree to take more refugees? And I'm happy to have Ambassador Baran weigh on that as well.
I think both of the suggestions you've just made are right on target. One is more private giving to help people. It's normal for Americans to be quite generous in response to crises, especially we see natural disasters get a really great humanitarian response. Half of American households contributed after the Haiti earthquake. What we don't see is similar levels of private giving to people caught up in the Syria crisis. And my hypothesis is because it's a messy, complicated crisis. And we also read every day about sort of evildoers in the region. But let me assure this group, but also Americans generally, that there are a lot of innocent families caught up in this crisis who are the victims and trying to be the survivors of this crisis. So it would be wonderful if we could somehow get private giving to catch fire and to happen at greater levels than it has so far. And I'm particularly interested in giving through Save the Children, through UNICEF, doing more for the children who are the innocent victims of this crisis. The other point you were just making, which has completely escaped my brain now, was very important.
About the internet and about, is it about the internet maybe?
No.
Foreign fighters? No. Okay.
About resettlement of refugees.
yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a big, important part of my job that I forgot about for a few minutes.
It's okay, it's still early.
So we have a tradition in the United States of bringing some of the world's refugees to the United States, restart their lives here, and sometimes in the same generation or the second generation, you end up with great American citizens who give much more to our country than their families have ever taken. We see right now that this ISIL-Daesh issue is sort of poisoning the discussion we're having about bringing more refugees from the Middle East to the United States. There's a sense that any refugee could be a terrorist. And that's clearly not the case, but for those of us who want to continue this tradition, who want to bring refugees to the United States, we have to do so in a way that is super, super careful and removes any doubt about who it is we're bringing. And so we're focusing right now on bringing people who have special needs, who are particularly vulnerable, victims of torture, people with special medical needs, widows and orphans, the elderly, the disabled. They will need a lot of help when they get here. But what I'm pushing back against is this sense that we should somehow stop doing this because we really don't know who these people are. I think we have a record, having brought 3 million people to the United States since the Vietnam era. We have a record that this can be done. It's a very successful program. It's part of who we are as a people. And I know, we've talked about this, the ambassador and I, this is a very important way for Americans to show solidarity with a country like Jordan that's taken in so many refugees, that we too should continue bringing just a fraction of those refugees to the United States.
Ambassador, do you want to comment?
Thank you so much. I just want to reiterate our thanks and appreciation for everything that the United States has been doing and helping Jordan to be able to shoulder this huge humanitarian responsibility. In Jordan, we are hosting right now 1.3 Syrians. 660,000 are registered within the US.
1.3 million.
Million, yeah. 660,000 are registered with the UNHCR. The rest are, all over. But out of the 660,000, only 20% are in camps. The rest, as Anne said, are all over the cities and towns in Jordan. All this, we've seen it in Amman. We see it on the streets of Irbid, Zarqa, Rusayfa, and all the big cities in Jordan. This is putting a huge, huge burden on the economy. But nevertheless, we have opened the borders. We continue to open the borders. We have opened our hearts and arms and everything to those fleeing refugees from Syria and before that from Iraq, and we do it with pride. But when the issue comes to for example, the competition over a workplace or crowding out Jordanians from their jobs and replacement of Syrians, becomes an issue of social debate. Many times you hear in our parliament, some parliamentarians urge the government to close the borders, saying we had enough, we had too many refugees, the prices are up, inflation is up, and so on and so forth. But we also know that if you would take a piece of paper to that parliamentarian and you tell him or her, sign here, and the government will close the borders right now, nobody will do that. Because deep in their hearts, in our hearts, in every Jordanian heart, you will say, right now, maybe the family is crossing, maybe an elderly is in need, or there's a child that needs medical care, and so on and so forth. So we take this inside, we are resilient, we're strong, we're extremely proud that we are able to do all good to those who are seeking refuge in Jordan. And we thank you so much, Ambassador Patterson and Anne, for all the support that you're providing us. You are at the forefront in terms of helping Jordan to be able to take care of the refugees. You are our voice with the international community when it comes to you saying to the rest of the international community, help Jordan as we are helping them. And the pressures are huge. Going back to one very, very important point, if I may, very, very quickly, it has to do with education. Education is a big security issue in the near future. We were just talking about it just before the session. A 7-year-old right now in Jordan is a child. He's playing outside, doesn't know much what's happening around him. Fast forward 10 years from now, that young child is a 17-year-old. If that child is left uneducated and not attended to, definitely that child is going to be, or that young man is going to be lured into radicalism. That's why we have in Jordan incorporated 124,000 Syrians in our schools. But, you know, the capacity is huge. 30,000 are still on waiting lists, waiting to be enrolled in our schools. We're doing so much because of the fact that we want to give basic education and we want to give the right for that child to know right from wrong, so that when the moment comes, that person will be able to say no to ISIS, no to radicalism, no to ethnicities, no to sectarianism. And we are very, very proud of what we are able to do with the little resources that we have. And we urge the international community to help Jordan so that we can do more of the things that we really know what to do.
Thank you. I'm glad you were able to pull that together, because it's, I mean, the challenges are just beyond daunting right now. I just want to conclude by asking Michelle Flournoy and Secretary Patterson to everyone in this room, you know, we all run in, you know, our friends, family, people who live across the country, you know, you bring up the Middle East and the reaction is, oh my gosh, it's just a mess, and why do we have to worry about it? I'm just tired of hearing about it. What is the message, Michelle and Anne, for us to take back to the rest of the country about why the Middle East matters? Michelle.
You know, I think that the first thing I would say is problems like this don't get better when we ignore them or try to turn our backs on them. Our options tend to diminish over time, and so forth. I also truly believe that many of these very difficult problems can be addressed when we pull together an international coalition that has a clear strategy and a commitment to stay with it over time. And I do believe that the U.S. can is the only country that's able to play that unique leadership role in pulling together. This isn't to say that, you know, this is always going to be about the use of the military or military action. But even when it comes to pulling together international funding to deal with the refugee crisis or the humanitarian crisis or the need for broader secular education in the region or the support for civil institutions and gradual political reform. I mean, all of these require U.S. leadership playing a key role. Again, if we were to try to ignore, you know, we may lose interest in the region in some parts of the United States, but what's going on in the region will not forget us. Meaning, eventually, threats that we leave unattended will reach out and touch us in ways that will force a response. And we will also lose the possibility of taking advantage of key opportunities to make a difference. So I think this is an area where we have to be engaged. We have to have a certain humility about what we can and can't accomplish. But I also think it's very much in our interests to try to pull together the international community to make progress on these problems.
Last word, Ann Patterson.
The very similar message. This is going to require strategic patience. And it's going to require a long-term investment of resources and intellectual capital that actually we've given to other parts of the world in the past 50 years, in Latin America, which was not nearly so difficult, in Asia. So we can exercise leadership, and I think we will exercise leadership in this area. But I too am a little unnerved by the, let's forget it, it's a mess, we never want to have anything to do with it, aggravated by our increasing energy independence, that we don't need this part of the world anymore, because it will jump up and bite us. So that would be my message: strategic patience.
Well, it's been an extraordinary panel. Let's thank Ann Patterson, Michelle Flournoy, Ambassador Baran, and Richard. Thank you all very much.